Welcome to the second webinar entitled Engage 3 Example Profiles. Over the next 16 minutes, Dr. Jodie Adele and I will provide more of an insight into some real Engage profiles. If you haven't come across Engage before, please do watch our first Introduction to Engage webinar, as it tells you what Engage is and what it does. It's available on the website. So welcome, my name is Mark Bateman. I'm the CEO of Engage.
I'm Jodie, and I've been researching and developing Engage since 2006.
The very first profile that we're going to look at then is Mary's Engage profile. So Mary is a manager on a development program. She's received an email inviting her to complete Engage online for herself, which took her about 10 minutes to do. What we're going to do is go through her report. So Jodie, what is it that we're seeing here?
This is the first part of the report. When we get into the reports, we have the high-level summary, and this is what we're looking at here. And combined, we have an overall total score of engagement, which is 5.
So what this is showing then is really a summary of the underlying 15 scales. Here's one of the pages from the self-development report. Can you just talk us through what that profile is showing us?
What we're going to see here are the next two slides, which look at the two charts within the report. And the first chart that we're looking at here is the construct chart. And what we get is an overall profile for Mary. In the top, the confidence factors in purple, we have 5 scores. The middle section in blue, which are the openness factors, again 5 scores. And then the impact factors in green at the bottom of the chart, which again we have 5 scores. So what we have here is the second chart, and essentially what we see here are the development priorities.
What does it mean by accelerators?
So when we talk about accelerators, essentially we're talking about those scores where we rate ourselves higher. Typically we might think of these as being strengths.
And so inhibitors then, is that the opposite of accelerators?
Well, inhibitors start to identify areas where we might focus more development attention. They're where we're currently rating ourselves quite low. So we might want to start here, and we might want to focus a little bit more of our energy and attention in inhibitors.
So by inhibitor you mean something that really holds somebody back?
Yeah, these are areas that really might interfere with us making progress or making some of the changes that we need to do in order to achieve some of the outcomes that we want.
So the areas that are marked in the middle underneath growth, do we not need to worry about those?
These are areas that still might need some attention, but they're not necessarily going to currently interfere or leverage necessarily.
So then in terms of the report, we've seen an overall summary, we've seen a development summary, we've gone through the 15 scales, we see where the accelerators, the growth areas and inhibitors are. So this next page then, Jodie, talk us through this.
What we see here on the screen are the narratives. So within every report, once we've worked through the different profile charts, we get a narrative summary for each of the 15 scales.
Okay, so what we've got here is just one of the 15 scales, as I see it, Jodie, where Mary on the personal influence scale has scored a 1. So can you just talk us through what this is?
For each of the 15 scales, you'll get a similar descriptive narrative. In the first paragraph, we have a description of what personal influence means at that particular rating.
And so what we see here is the feedback. This might be the kind of feedback that a very experienced coach or a psychologist might give back to an individual who has scored themselves very lowly on personal influence. Is that the case?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what we're doing here is providing guidance to an individual who is working with Mary to improve or increase her score around personal influence. So where does guidance come in?
So the guidance section provides you with some very powerful questions that really help you tap into the feedback section. So we know that the feedback is relevant. How do we actually then start to support the individual to work on some of these areas?
So to me, this looks like some very, very powerful questions.
These questions really guide you on how to do some very deep reflection in these areas. So if you really choose to work on this area, this becomes very relevant and it helps you work on these areas.
So the power of Engage then is not just that it diagnoses your internal mindset, but then it gives you a methodology to really work through and focus in on those areas that are currently holding you back.
Absolutely. So whether you're a very experienced coach or a less experienced coach, it's really helpful to have those questions to hand, because that really enables and makes sure that you're tapping into the relevant things.
So talk us through then the key reflections. Obviously on this slide here, I haven't got much space there. In the report itself, there's a much bigger space there to capture key reflections. What's that for?
So the key reflections is where you start to capture what was relevant for you on this particular scale, on this particular narrative. So if you want to actually start working on this area, it helps you capture that and summarise your reflections.
So it really makes it personable. And I guess what that does then is it starts to really lead into another page now that you would find within the self-development report, which is entitled Personal Development Plan. So here we have a number of boxes that allows Mary to now write her own personal development plan. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that page?
If you don't currently have your own personal development plan, this can be really helpful. It encourages you to go through the report, to draw upon some of those key reflections that have really stood out for you as you've gone through your profile, and it encourages you to then capture them into a goal, so to start setting some very tangible, real goals. So it's been designed to be very practical in the way that you use it. So having set a goal, you would then anchor that into some action. So what are the next steps? What are those real actions that you're going to do? So not only the practical steps, but when, how, who. So you're encouraged to really get very smart in your action planning. And then you have a section around evaluate. So this section encourages you to really think about how are you going to know when you've made a difference? How are you going to know if something has changed as a result of working on this particular area? So in essence, how are you going to measure the impact and the change? And then the key learning really encourages you to think about what have you learnt, what is different, to really capture your thinking around this.
So it's a very reflective piece to allow an individual to write their own personal development plan, whether in a sense whether they're working on their own or whether they're working with a coach or somebody else internal to the organisation. So then if we move into some of the detail within the report, so here we've highlighted the first scale of confidence with the 5 particular areas. So Jodie, looking at this, what is it you would see? What is it you would focus in on if you were working with Mary?
Your eye is drawn towards some of the high and low scores when you work with a profile. So what we can see here with Mary, particularly around personal influence, she's rated herself a 1. So that's as low as you could rate yourself.
That doesn't sound good.
I think it's really important not to judge. So we're not looking at whether something is good or bad. What we're trying to do is understand what the implication of that is. And I think that's a really important point.
And just remind me, where does that score actually come from?
So personal influence is really tapping into the extent to which we believe we can influence the outcome, the event, the stakeholder. So I think this is a really useful one to highlight because it's not looking at behaviours around influencing. So it's not looking at are you able to influence. More importantly, it looks at your personal belief in being able to influence the outcome.
So this isn't rating me against other people then?
No,
You're not
not at all.
comparing me against a norm group in any way?
No. So we are rating ourselves against ourselves. So this is a self-reference rating. So it's actually how you view yourself, which is very significant in terms of what you then do. So it's really important that self-view will really inform the action and the behaviour.
Okay, so in terms of the second set of scales around openness, so again, I guess that you are looking at both the low scores and the high scores?
Yeah, so what we see here are the openness scores, and what we're looking at are 3 distilled areas. So openness to feedback and communication, openness to change, and openness around process. So that looks a little bit around attitudes.
And I see there's 3 areas in the inhibitor stages there. So does this suggest that Mary doesn't believe she's that open?
So this would start to indicate that perhaps Mary's not quite as open as she needs to be in order to make progress. What we do know is that the more open we are to learning, to development, that we're likely to make more progress.
Moving on then to Mary's openness scores, what do you see there?
What's really interesting about Mary's profile is the adaptability score. So that's a rating of 2, which is low. So that would indicate that at the moment Mary is perhaps less flexible and takes a fairly rigid approach to the way she works. So when faced with having to make new changes, Mary might find that quite difficult to do.
And so if we were to then look at the narrative section of the report and focusing on adaptability, what might some of the feedback be there, and what might be some of the questions?
This would seek to really get Mary to reflect on what are the consequences and the implications of having a low score. So actually, when we are fairly inflexible, what is the outcome, particularly in terms of development? So when we need to change the way that we think, when we need to change the way we behave in certain situations because we need a different outcome and a different result, it's really important that we start to think more flexibly around that.
And so finally, the third section where we look at the fire scales around impact. So here actually we don't see any real inhibitors, we see a number of growth areas and one accelerator. So again, Jodie, tell us, what do you see when you see this scale?
One score which is higher, so that's emotional commitment, where Mary's rated herself fairly high. That would suggest to me that at the moment she's feeling quite committed to the organisation and she has a sense of loyalty and belonging to the organisation, and the very positive benefits around that. Typically when we feel more committed, we feel more empowered, we feel motivated. So there are very strong links in terms of research around satisfaction, retention and productivity. However, what we do notice is some of those performance related scales, they're kind of sitting in the middle for Mary. So I'd be really intrigued to know why Mary's not rating herself higher on some of those things. And I'd really be interested to know what would motivate her to push the boundaries a little bit.
Okay, so we've spent some time looking at Mary's profile. So here's a second example. What I see here is somebody who has scored themselves very highly, sitting in the accelerator with some growth areas. So what is it you see when you see this profile?
My first question, is there an opportunity to be slightly more self-critical? So when we rate ourselves very high on scores, that would suggest that either we have gone through a lot of development, so we're really developed in all these areas, or perhaps we could have been slightly more self-critical. I think one of the interesting features that we're seeing in this particular profile is that there are quite a lot of 10 ratings of 10, which is...
Isn't that good? Isn't that what you want?
This is a really interesting feature of Engage. So 10 can be a strength, but actually introduces us to the concept of derailment. So a derailment is something where it can act as a strength, but actually might also present a few blind spots for us.
And so finally, a third example, and here we have far more dots within the inhibitor and growth, and actually only one or two with an accelerator. So it's almost as if this is the mirror opposite of example 2.
What we're seeing here are patterns, and what we can see is there a tendency on this particular profile to rate fairly low across many of the scores here. So that would suggest that this particular individual might have been overly self-critical, or it might actually mean that they've not really been through very much development. So there's real opportunity here to start building on some of those confidence scores and start building more openness to different ways of thinking and different ways of behaving.
So as a result of going through this process with this individual, what might you hope to happen?
I would certainly, with this particular individual, really start building trust within the relationship at the beginning, to start opening them up to some of the possibilities. Because what we do know is that when we stay open and we're open-minded, we can start working on some of those areas that are really going to make a difference in terms of our own potential, but also delivery within our role.
So what we've seen then is 3 examples: Mary plus the example 2 who scored themselves very highly, and example 3 maybe they scored themselves more lowly. What you're suggesting actually is that the Engage process with the methodology that sits on the back is suitable for each one of those 3 types of individuals.
Absolutely. And what this gives us is a very unique and tailored way of working with individuals, so that the feedback and the guidance that you find within these reports are very specific and really help them start building on some of those key areas.
What we're very conscious of within Engage is that those individuals who work with Engage to have the real confidence to work with Engage as a product. So what we're offering now is an accreditation process where individuals who want to utilize the Engage tool set, product set, and methodology become an accredited coach or an accredited practitioner. And if you'd like to do that, we do that through one of three ways. You can either do an online webinar, which is suitable for those experienced coaches, experienced L&D professionals, maybe you're A and B or personality and ability accredited, or maybe you would like to become accredited through a full day face-to-face program, or maybe actually you're an organisation, you're looking to accredit your own in-house coaches or in-house learning and development specialists.
When you do the face-to-face in-house programs, you get that real opportunity to go through live case studies and to practice the feedback. So for those less experienced coaches, that becomes particularly valuable.
In either case, we recommend you go to engagecoach.com/accreditation. We'd like to invite you now to our next live webinar with Dr. Jodie Odell, and during that webinar there'll be a lot of opportunity to answer your questions. Simply register yourself by going to engagecoach.com/next, and on that page you can either select to register for this live webinar, or indeed if you want to use Engage within your own company, if you want a sales call, if you want access to our masterclasses or our accreditation programs, all the detail is on there. Simply register and we will be in touch. Thank you very much.